A story is about to start. So open your ears and open your heart. Today we're going to be doing a story that is similar to a fable. So we've kind of made up a little fable song, and if you remember it, I'd love for you to do it with me. You can slap your knees, and we're going to say it together. Here we go. A fable is a story that teaches a lesson. A fable is a story that teaches a lesson. A fable is a story that teaches a lesson. So, let's see what lesson we might have to learn today from our story. This story comes from an anthology, which means there are lots of stories in this book. This anthology is called Feathers and Tales and contains a lot of different stories that happen to be similar to fables. This story is called The Four Friends. It was another time long ago that a wise old crow lived in a ginkgo tree. From his favorite perch, he could look over all the land that he had come to think of as his own. Although he had many friends in the forests and valleys, foxes, tigers, bears, and badgers, just to name a few, he liked to keep himself alone most of the time. One day, while Crow was sitting on his favorite branch, high up in the ginkgo tree, which was his home, a hunter came and spread out a large net beneath his perch. He sprinkled it with fine yellow seeds, and the crow never stirred, but sat and watched as the hunter disappeared into the brush. It wasn't long before a flock of doves gathered on the ground and, without noticing that there was a net there, began to munch on the seeds. So here's our crow up high in his tree, and here's our little doves munching on those seeds. I can turn it this way if that's helpful. Crow was about to holler down to warn them when one of the doves stepped on the drawstring and whoosh! The net suddenly drew up and around their bodies and trapped them all inside. The doves began squirming and crying, but their leader called out, "Flap your wings! Flap your wings!" He knew that the hunter would soon be returning to catch them, and if they didn't get away at once, they would all be killed. The doves began flapping their wings for all that they were worth, and an amazing thing happened. The net began to rise into the air. Crow was amazed, not only by the cleverness of their leader, but by the sight of a flying net. Crow flew straight up from his perch and began flapping his own wings in imitation to encourage them. He was cheering for the doves to escape. The doves rose higher and higher, clearing the trees at the edge of the wood, and Crow flew behind them and above them and around them and even ahead of them. He was cawing as loud as he could. Can you caw like a crow? Caw, caw! I don't know if I'm very good at a crow sound, but I tried. They kind of sound almost scratchy sometimes when they caw, but yeah. The doves flew on and on until at last they dropped from exhaustion, trembling in a heap on the ground. And there they lay one by one on top of each other, too weak to move. Crow flew to a nearby tree and stared down at the trapped doves, who were trying to flap and flutter as best as they could. They had escaped the clever captor, but they were still stuck inside of their knotty prison. Then the crow spotted a mouse peering out from his burrow in the meadow. Mouse sniffed the air and stared all around. He raced over to the doves, who were chirping feebly at one another. Without a moment's hesitation, the mouse began chewing on the ropes. He chewed and chewed until he had made a small opening. So here's our doves. They're flying together, and Crow is encouraging them. And here's our little mousie. Crow looked in amazement down at the doves, who began popping out of the net one by one, flying up and down. The doves began chirping and cooing and congratulating themselves on their escape, and the mouse scurried back to his burrow before the doves had a chance to thank him for the rescue. Crow stared down in amazement. He wanted to help the doves, but he hadn't known how. But Mouse knew just what to do and when to do it, and he had the right equipment, his teeth. Mouse was about to enter the hole when he noticed the crow for the first time. Crow was leaning over on his branch with his beak wide open. "Please, Mr. Mouse," he said, "I'd like to be your friend." I don't know who was more surprised by these words, the crow or the mouse, because Crow had always been the mouse's enemy, and so of course no mouse had ever been friend to a crow. Although this was true, Mouse somehow knew that Crow was serious, and also sincere. Mouse somehow knew that Crow was telling the truth. Crow said next, I watched the doves as they caught and then escaped, and then I saw you set them free." Crow stopped and thought. He just couldn't think of how to say all that was on his mind. "I'll be your friend if you like," said the mouse, before disappearing down in the hole. He was too anxious to take a nap after all that hard work he had done. So there's the crow peering down, sees all the little doves going free, and there's our little mousie going back to his hole because he's finished his job. All right. From that day on, Mouse and Crow shared their stories and experiences and called on each other for favors and advice. Although Crow was happy because of his friendship with Mouse, he was not pleased with his new home in the meadow. One day he asked Mouse if they could move away and start a new life by a pond, where his friend Tortoise lived. After thinking it over, Mouse agreed. He swept out his burrow for the last time, and after gathering a few of his belongings, he climbed up on the crow's back, and they flew off together. This time, Crow made his home in a willow tree, high above the water, where Mouse built a new private burrow near the bank. Tortoise looked on from her rock at the edge of the pond. She was pleased with her new friend she had made and with the return of her old friend, Crow. Crow and Mouse were hardly settled into their new quarters when, to everybody's surprise, a long-legged white gazelle came bounding into their lair from out of a neighboring wood. Crow flew straight up into his tree, and Tortoise slid off the rock into the pond, and Mouse jumped down into his burrow. When they had collected their wits and looked out from their secret hiding places, the three friends saw that the gazelle was quietly drinking from the pond. So there is our little mouse flying on Crow's back. And there's a gazelle taking a drink, and the crow is high above watching. Crow puffed up his feathers and stuck out his chest and lowered his voice and said with authority, "What's the matter, Miss Gazelle?" "I've been fleeing hunters," Miss Gazelle replied, looking up and panting. "I've lost them in the woods. Just as soon as I get a drink, I'll be out of your way." The three friends gathered around the gazelle and assured her that she was safe to stay with them and be their friend. "We're a team," they explained. "That's right," Mouse said, and Tortoise poked her head out of her shell in agreement, with which action, she felt, spoke louder than words. Gazelle decided to stay, and to her surprise, she soon became very fond of her new friends. Mouse, Crow, and Tortoise were homebodies, but Gazelle liked to wander around the woods and explore hidden places. Sometimes she'd be gone all day and all night, but every evening she would return to share her experiences with her friends. So look, we've got everybody here. Many seasons passed in this way until one unhappy day, Gazelle did not return to their camp in the evening. Mouse and Crow and Tortoise were very worried. "What should we do?" they kept repeating to one another. What should we do? That night, they didn't try to sleep but stayed up all night to figure out what to do. Early the next morning, Crow flew off into the woods and across the meadow. It wasn't long before he spotted Gazelle. She was trapped in a net. Crow swooped down beside Gazelle.
"Don't worry," he said. "Please don't worry. I'm sure we'll find a way to save you."
Although Crow had seen a hunter approaching, he knew that if he could bring Mouse to rescue Gazelle before the hunter arrived, his friend would be saved. Crow flew back at once and told Mouse and Tortoise what he had seen. He lifted up Mouse with his strong legs, and they flew off to rescue Gazelle. Tortoise scurried after them as fast as her little legs could take her, although a tortoise is not very fast, so trying her best. Gazelle looked pitiful, all scrunched up in a net, but when she saw her friends, she smiled feebly. Mouse chewed away at the snare while Crow stood guard. But in the excitement, Crow forgot about the approaching hunter, and by the time the Mouse had freed the Gazelle, Tortoise had showed up. And when she saw Gazelle being freed, she gave a loud cheer, and just as she did, the four friends heard the hammer of a gun going into position, and they turned to see the hunter taking careful aim at the Gazelle. But before he could fire, Gazelle leaped into the woods and raced away. Crow flew straight up into the air, and Mouse scurried into the underbrush. But Tortoise had nowhere to hide. The hunter grabbed Tortoise and made a noose around her shell. Then he tossed Tortoise over his shoulder and headed off into the woods to pursue the Gazelle. Gazelle made a wide circle and returned to her friends, who quickly told her what had happened to Tortoise. The three friends put their heads together and devised a clever plan to rescue Tortoise. That night, Gazelle circled ahead of the hunter and lay down in his path, pretending to be wounded. That means he pretended he was hurt, and so he's laying there. This was Crow's signal to fly down and begin pecking at Gazelle's imaginary wound. When the hunter saw Gazelle lying down, he lurched forward and pulled out his knife, and as he did, the tortoise slipped free from his shoulder. Before the hunter could reach her, Gazelle slowly rose to her feet and hobbled off through the trees, still pretending to be wounded. She led the hunter on a wild chase through the woods. Crow and Mouse flew back to Tortoise. Mouse began chewing on the rope around Tortoise's shell, and by the time the hunter gave up the chase and returned for Tortoise, the friends had safely escaped. Crow, Mouse, and Tortoise hurried home through the woods, knowing that Gazelle would be waiting for them at the pond. Discouraged by his bad luck and sensing an omen, the hunter moved away to another land far, far away. Gazelle, Mouse, and Tortoise, and wise old Crow embraced each other and rejoiced, knowing that they would be able to live with each other in happiness and peace forever. There's the mouse and the tortoise. Look at them all together. And so I think a good lesson for this story is that sometimes the people that you might least expect could be the best of friends, just how maybe normally you wouldn't expect a crow, a mouse, a tortoise, and a gazelle to be friends. But look at how well they work together, because each of them had different strengths and different gifts and different talents and abilities. And together they were able to keep each other safe and love each other well. Maybe think about your friends today. What are some special things that you have to offer to your friends? Or what are some things that are different about your friends that maybe you could learn from them, or that could help you to grow as a person? I know I have lots of friends that are different than me, but I'm very blessed that they're different than me, because I have so much to learn from those who are not the same as me. Have a wonderful day. Bye.